Joyce sent out in her email asking you to listen to the song Raise a Hallelujah. I don't know if you all had a chance to do that or not. It's printed on the flip side of the insert in your bulletin, Raise a Hallelujah. And the first 4 lines, I raise a hallelujah in the presence of my enemies. I raise a hallelujah louder than the unbelief. I raise a hallelujah. My weapon is a melody. I raise a hallelujah. Heaven comes to fight for me. I invite you to hang on to that line. I raise a hallelujah. My weapon is a melody. Because I have a story to tell. Y'all know I love to tell stories. This story was I have adapted it from a story written by Robert Fulghum in his book, Maybe, Maybe Not, Second Thoughts from a Secret Life. Perhaps you know Robert Fulghum from his book, All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. I enjoy Robert Fulghum a lot, and this story really spoke to me. I invite you all to use your imaginations with me as you hear this story. It's the year 2050, not 2015, but 2050, in a large Eastern European city, one that has survived the ups and downs of more than 1,000 years of human activity. In an open square in the city center, there's a rather odd civic monument, a bronze statue. It's not a soldier, not a politician, not a general, and not a king on a throne. Instead, the figure is of a somewhat common man, sitting in a chair, playing his cello. Around the pedestal on which this statue sits, there are bouquets of flowers. And if you stop and count, you will always find 22 flowers in each bunch. The cellist is a national hero. If you ask to hear his story, you'll be told of a time of civil war in this city. Demagogues lit bonfires of hatred between citizens who belonged to different religious and ethnic groups. Everyone became an enemy of someone else. None was exempt or safe. Many were maimed, many were killed. Those who did not die lived like animals in the ruins of the city, except one man, a musician, a cellist. He came to a certain street corner every day, dressed in formal black evening clothes, sitting on a fire-charred chair. He played his cello. Knowing that he might be shot or beaten, still he played. Day after day he came to play the most beautiful music that he knew. Day after day for 22 days. His music was stronger than hate, and his courage stronger than fear. And in time, other musicians were captured by his spirit, and they took their places in the street beside him. These acts of courage were contagious. Anyone who could play an instrument or sing found a place at a street intersection somewhere in the city and made music. And in time, the fighting stopped. The music and the city and the people lived on. Now, is this a nice fable, a lovely story, something that adults might make up to inspire children? Is there any truth in this parable, in this story? We know that the real world doesn't work this way. We all know that cellists seldom become civic heroes. Music doesn't affect wars. There's a man named Vedran Smajlovic who does not agree. In the New York Times Magazine in July of 1992, his photograph appeared. Middle-aged, longish hair, great bushy mustache. He's dressed in formal evening clothes, and he's sitting in a cafe chair in the middle of the street. He's sitting in front of a bakery where mortar fire struck a bread line in late May, killing 22 people. And he's playing his cello, As a member of the Sarajevo Opera Orchestra, there is little that he can do about hate and war, but he can play his cello. So every day for 22 days, he has braved sniper and artillery fire because he wanted to play Albinani's profoundly moving Adagio in G minor. I listened to it. It's a beautiful piece of music. Adagio in G minor by Albinani. Is this man crazy? Was he crazy? Maybe. Was his gesture futile? Yes, in a conventional sense, of course. What can a cellist do? What madness to go out alone in the streets and address the world with a wooden box and a horse bow hair. What can a cellist do? All he knows how to do. Speaking softly with his cello, one note at a time, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, calling out the rats that infest the human spirit. Vedran Smajlovic is a real person, and what he did is true. Neither the breadline, nor the mortar shell, nor the music is fiction. Most everyone in Sarajevo knows now what a cellist can do. The place where Vedran played has become an informal shrine, a place of honor. Croats, Serbs, Muslims, Christians alike, they all know his name and this place. They know his face. They know his music. And they place flowers right where he played, commemorating the hope that must never die, that someday, somehow, the best of humanity shall overcome the worst, not through unexpected miracles, but through the intentional acts of individuals. And you know, Sarajevo is not the only place where Vedran Smajlovic is known. An artist in Seattle, Washington saw his picture and read his story. Her name is Billie's brother. A real person, a real name, really lived in Seattle, Washington. And what can an artist do? Well, she organized 22 cellists to play in 22 public places in Seattle for 22 days. And on the final day, all 22 cellists came together to play in one place, in front of a store window, displaying burned out bread pans, 22 loaves of bread, and 22 roses. People came. Newspaper reporters and television cameras were there. The story and the pictures were fed into the news networks of the world, and they were passed back to Vedran Smajlovic, that he knew that his music had been heard and passed on throughout the world. Millions of people saw Vedran's story in the New York Times. Millions have seen it and heard the continuing story picked up by the media. And now you too, each one of you, know the story, and you're invited to tell it to someone else. This is urgent news. Let's keep it alive in the world. As for the end of the story, who among us shall insist the rest of the story cannot be true? Who might say that a monument in the park in Sarajevo will never come to pass? Fulgham says, the cynic who lives in a dark hole in my most secret mind says one cellist cannot stop a war, and music can ultimately be only a dirge played over the unimaginable. But somewhere, Fulgham says, somewhere in my soul, I know otherwise. He calls us to listen. Never, ever regret or apologize for believing that when one man or one woman decides to risk addressing the world with truth, the world may stop what it's doing and hear. There is too much evidence to the contrary. When we cease believing this, the music will surely stop. Fulgham says, in my imagination, I lay flowers at the statue memorializing Vedran Smajlovic, a monument that has not yet been built, but may be in the future. I love love this story, especially right now, because of some of the things that we're hearing, especially out of the Ukraine. I love this story. I imagine this man sitting alone at an intersection playing his cello because that's what he was called to do. I want to tell you another story, one you're probably familiar with, about a man who was doing what he was called to do by God. Jesus was an individual man doing what he was called to do in the world. And in today's passage, he's on his way to Jerusalem. In the Gospel according to Luke, this journey, the entire journey begins at Luke 9, verse 51, where it says, "When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem." This journey goes on, which you talked about today, until his triumphal entry into Jerusalem in Luke 19. So in today's passage, we're right in the middle of the story, kind of like being right in the middle of Lent today. We know from the passage that Jesus was warned by the Pharisees that Herod wanted him dead. Herod is the puppet king put in place by the Romans. This is Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great, who wanted to kill Jesus when he was an infant. Jesus does not intend to flee from Herod or allow the Pharisees to dissuade him. He has work to do. He is following God's agenda. He even tells the Pharisees, "Go and tell that fox that I've got work to do." Now, when we think of a fox today, we often think of somebody that's sly or crafty, but in Jesus' day, in rabbinical literature, fox is often a term of contempt. So he was not kind when he talked about Herod, and he's not afraid. He's following his calling. And Jerusalem, of course, is the holy city, the home of the temple, and all the sacrificial rituals that you talked about today that are conducted in accordance with the law. However, the center of godly worship, Jerusalem, is also the center of cosmic struggle. Jerusalem has been the place that has killed prophets. They killed Uriah, they killed Zechariah, and they tried to kill Jeremiah. One of Jesus' 3 temptations took place on the pinnacle of the temple. And in today's passage, he pronounces judgment on the city that had killed the prophets. The chief priests, the scribes, and religious leaders of Jerusalem, we know, will seek to kill Jesus and eventually succeed, because we know this story. We've heard this story. We've read this story. But at this point in the story, Jesus turns to where he is headed, and he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." And the repetition of a name in that time, in that age, often signified great pain, great grief, or frustration. We could read this in 2 Samuel when David said, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, I wish I had died for you. Absalom, my son, my son." With the repetition, we hear the grief. Can we hear the grief in Jesus' voice? "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." We're hearing a cry of grief reflecting his broken heart, knowing that he could be saved, but instead he's going to be killed because of the city's obstinate attitude toward God's authority. Jesus goes on to say, "How often I wanted to gather your children together, like a hen gathers her own brood under her wings." Jesus assures Jerusalem that he longs to give them this protective care. The tragedy is that they're not willing to receive it. In verse 35 of today's passage, Jesus says, "Behold, your house is left to you desolate." We know that in 587 BCE, Jerusalem experienced destruction by Babylonia. Many of Jerusalem's inhabitants were killed, and the rest were driven out into exile. And eventually a small number were allowed to return, and over time they rebuilt the city. And now Jesus is saying that Jerusalem will once again be left to its own devices. Having rejected God's ways, it will face danger without God's help. I tell you, Jesus says, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. At Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, we'll hear these words, but it will not be Jerusalem that says it. It will be the disciples of Jesus who say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And that we know happened, and we claim it happened on Palm Sunday, further down on the journey, the Sunday before Easter. Now, in my mind, there is a connection between these two stories. And the first story that I told you about, Vedran Smajlovic and Jesus, these are connected. Some of the connections include two individual men braving what's possible before them. They each know the dangers. Smajlovic comforts people with his music, and Jesus desires to comfort the people of Jerusalem. What Smajlovic did was heard around the world, and of course we know the message Jesus brought to the world was shared and is still shared, much like you're encouraged to share Smajlovic's story with other people. You know, sometimes the truth is I don't know how to pull everything together in a Sunday morning message. Sometimes I just need to say what God has given me to say and then allow you to make sense of it or to make connections. I invite you to sit with it a bit today and over the week and hopefully discover what God is saying to you in this particular message. Not what the pastor's telling you, what to think or to hear or believe. And maybe that's a cop-out on my part, but I have more to say. But I invite you to think about these two stories and how they fit together. I've been talking about what Jesus did and what Smajlovic did. Robert Myers, who's the author of Saving God from Religion, A Minister's Search for Faith in a Skeptical Age, wrote, consider this remarkable fact. In the Sermon on the Mount, there's not a single word about what to believe, only words about what to do and how to be. By the time the Nicene Creed was written, only 3 centuries later, there's not a single word in it about what to do or how to be, only words about what to believe. Things shifted there. The intent was to look at how we can be, what we do in the world, and it switched to just what we believe was important. Howard Zinn, an American historian, playwright, philosopher, and World War II veteran, wrote, to be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are many, so many, where people have believed magnificently, this gives us energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of the world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of present moments. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. So I guess that's part of the message for this morning. Living is all about acting and being, like Smajlovic and like Jesus. Like others we can think of who have done courageous things, even if they're small things. They don't have to be big like these men did. Small acts of courage can also send the spinning top of the world in a different direction. And for a current day example, I saw on Facebook a chalk message on a sidewalk that said simply, in a world of Putins, be a Zelensky. There's so much more I could say about that. In a world of Putins, be a Zelensky. About about how we've seen each of these men act and be. And I encourage all of us to continue watching them and see who they are and how their messages are impacting and being lived out in the world today. Our being in the world does not take great acts of courage. Sometimes it's not being afraid of Herod and continually moving toward Jerusalem. Sometimes it's playing music in an intersection. And I'm sure you all can think of other ideas, other ways of being courageous in simple ways. The Lord is our salvation. Is there anyone to fear? This is a hymn that we're going to sing next. The hymn was written by Carolyn Winfrey Gillette. She's a Presbyterian clergy who writes wonderful hymns about all kinds of things, and she has one for different seasons of the year, but also for different events that happen. She wrote a hymn after the World Trade Towers fell. She's written, my mind isn't thinking right now, but for all kinds of things that have happened. And I found this hymn in her on her website, her list of all the hymns that she's written. It's titled "Since the Lord is My Salvation," and it's sung to "Come, Thou Fount of Every Blessing," a familiar hymn. So I want to invite us to stand and sing this together. The words are printed on the insert in your bulletin.